So, in a previous video, we talked about the combat in Lords of the Fallen, and the response to that was actually really interesting. A lot of you mentioned that the combat had some good ideas, but the weights, the responsiveness, the floatiness, and the overall feel didn't quite land for everyone. At least not until a few years later with all the updates. But something else started coming up in the comments too. People weren't just talking about combat, but they were also mentioning repetition, the game feeling like it loses momentum later on. And one key factor that kept showing up again and again was enemy variety. And then I remembered the more I played the game, the more the criticism made sense. Like with many Souls-likes, the experience feels fresh, with new areas, new threats, new things to learn when you first start out. But as you get deeper into the game, that sense of discovery starts to fade. And for this kind of game, that's a big problem. This genre depends on one thing more than anything else, and that's the feeling that the next area is going to challenge you in some new and meaningful way. When that stops happening, the game starts to feel predictable. Now, here's why this conversation matters right now. In one of the developers' previous interviews, about 40 minutes long, they talked about player feedback and what they've learned since launch. And one of the major topics they addressed was exactly this: enemy variety, repetition, and the feeling that the game starts strong but doesn't evolve enough as it goes on. What stood out is that they didn't really try to avoid the criticism. They acknowledged that players noticed the repetition, especially in the later parts of the game. And if you've played through the full experience, you probably know what they're talking about. The early hours introduce enemies at a steady pace. You're constantly adjusting, learning some new patterns, figuring out how different threats work together. But later on, instead of learning something new, you're mostly dealing with stronger versions of enemies you've already mastered. And that kind of messes with the entire feeling of progression. According to the developers, most of this came down to where their focus was during development. They put a huge amount of time into building the world itself, the scale of the environments, the visual detail, and especially the dual realm system, which is really the core identity of the game. And to be fair, that part absolutely shows. I mean, the world design and atmosphere are easily some of the strongest elements, but the trade-off was depth in other areas. Enemy variety, encounters, and late game evolution didn't get the same level of attention. And that's something they specifically talked about wanting to change moving forward. Instead of just making the world bigger, the goal is to make the experience denser, with more unique encounters, more mechanical variety, and more reasons for each new area to actually feel different to play. Another issue that came up, both from the players and in the developer discussion, is how enemies get reused across a bunch of regions. Now, reusing isn't automatically a problem. I mean, every Souls-like does it to some extent. I mean, did we really need to fight Moog twice and then basically as the final boss of the DLC a third time? A little bit of a spoiler, but basically it's Moog's body being used by Radon, being puppeted by Mikola, the femboy dude. The problem is when you start seeing the same enemies in completely different environments without much change. At that point, areas stop feeling different. Instead of each region having its own identity, everything starts to blend together. From what the devs said, one of their goals going forward is stronger regional design, so enemies that actually fit the environment, encounters that feel built for the space, and fewer situations where it feels like the same fight just got dropped into a different area.
For this game, we've taken that feedback not only on board, but kind of put like some nitrous oxide within it. So throughout the entire experience, you'll be constantly presented with new challenges in the form of enemies. So someone that you encounter in the first, say, biome, which I know we spoke about a lot last time, you will not be encountering them again like in another biome. It's a whole new set, therefore giving this real fresh take every single time. And what that gives us is not only variety, but it also helps us balance the experience in terms of punishment and escalation of the player, and also gets the player to consider their own build constantly. Like, okay, I've got into this, say, more melee-based faction, and I'm dealing well with this, but then in another faction where it's primarily magic or ranged, now I have to change my approach. So the pacing, we've not only taken it from the enemies, but we've really boiled that down into pretty much everything. So the player is constantly, I don't want to use the word on edge, but should be wary about what's around the corner, because they really might not know what's coming this time.
Variety isn't just about having more enemies. It's about how those enemies are used to shape the experience. They also talked about encounter design itself, which is an important part of this conversation. One of the problems players pointed out is that some sections increase difficulty by simply adding more enemies instead of introducing new mechanics. And that creates a whole different kind of challenge. Instead of learning something new, you're just managing numbers. That kind of difficulty feels more stressful than interesting, really. Going forward, the devs said they want combat situations to feel more intentional. Fewer filler fights, more encounters that actually test your positioning, timing, or decision making. If that approach shows up in the next one, the overall pacing would feel much more controlled. And honestly, that's probably just as important as adding new enemy types. But the biggest issue, and the one the devs spent a lot of time talking about, is the late game. This is where the repetition becomes the most noticeable. The classic, stronger versions of earlier enemies with the same combinations, and fewer moments where the game introduces something that really changes how you play. In a genre like this, built around escalation, that's where the experience starts losing most of its impact. They admitted that the variety curve drops off a little bit too early, and one of their main goals moving forward is to keep introducing new elements throughout the entire experience, not just the first half. The final hours of a Soulslike are supposed to feel like the peak, not the part where things start to feel familiar. Boss design connects to this problem too. The original game had some strong visual designs, but mechanically, not every boss felt distinct. And one decision that stood out to players was when certain bosses later appeared as regular enemies. Or, in the case of one of the final bosses, where you don't fight him at all. I don't know why games do that. The moment that happens, the sense of skill disappears. That major moment becomes just another obstacle. So the developers talked about wanting bosses to feel more unique and to remain meaningful, with stronger mechanics, with better identities, and fewer situations where a major encounter loses its impact later on. In a Souls-like, bosses are milestones, and if they don't feel special, it starts to feel flat. Another point they mentioned is that the first game was focused on establishing the foundation. The world with the dual realm concepts, the visual identity. Now that those systems exist, the focus can shift toward refinements, with less energy spent towards building new large-scale features and more attention on moment-to-moment gameplay. That kind of shift usually makes a sequel feel tighter and more confident, even if the overall scope doesn't increase. And really, that's where I think the series should go right now. They also mentioned how they've been watching player feedback since launch, with community discussions, lots and lots of criticism, and long-term reactions after the initial release window. And whether you take the devs' interviews at face value or not, the fact that they're directly addressing this, the pacing, the repetition, the variety, it suggests that they know what the biggest problems were. The real question isn't whether they understand the issues, it's whether they're actually going to prioritize fixing them. Again, as you guys commented in the previous video, it needs to fix its combat, and it should also increase its gameplay depth. Otherwise, the same problems will come back again and again. The combat discussion from before opened up a bigger conversation, not just about how the game feels moment to moment, but about how the experience holds up over time. Combat feel definitely matters, but variety, pacing, and progression are what keep players engaged for the full playthrough. If those systems fall off in the second half, even good mechanics start to feel repetitive. And that's really the biggest issue the developers seem to be focusing on now. So at this point, their direction seems to be making sense. The foundation is already there, the world design tends to work mostly, the atmosphere is pretty cool, the core ideas are strong, what the series needs now isn't more scale, it needs stronger progression. Enemy variety that lasts until the end, with bosses that stay meaningful. Encounters that feel intentional instead of repetitive. If they deliver that, the next entry could feel dramatically better without needing to reinvent everything. So, right now the direction sounds promising. They've acknowledged the criticism, they've talked about the exact issues players had, and their goals line up with the biggest problems people experienced. But this is still the stage where everything is just talk. What matters is whether enemy variety, pacing, and encounters actually improve in the next game. Because the first one had so much potential. And yet, if they don't, then we're probably going to have this conversation again. And I'm curious what you think. Was enemy variety the biggest issue for you, or was there something else that held the game back? Let me know in the comments, because the long-term direction of the series is going to depend a lot on whether they actually fix the problems players have been talking about. Well, that's all from me for now. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff, and I'll see you next time. Have a great one.